Can you tell me about that?
Sure. So that is one phenomenon that's actually become more frequent and something that from the takedown reports or analysis reports from, say, Microsoft or Meta, you really see this starting to be more widely used. It started a bit around 2020, midterm elections 2022, and now in the run-up to 2024 being used more. So just to give a few examples, so these are actual accounts, fake personas, who will pretend to be American voters. Sometimes what they'll be posting is just very kind of more incendiary, inflammatory, polarizing content on both sides of the political spectrum, right? Sometimes that's where you see some of the AI-generated memes that come up. In other cases, and in some cases, they actually are using the same personas across multiple platforms. So, of course, that makes it look more real. So one example in one of the recent reports was about accounts impersonating U.S. military families. And then one of these accounts actually started a petition about U.S. policy towards Taiwan and trying to have less U.S. support for Taiwan. And it got 300 signatures, right? So these are trying to impersonate real people and Americans. And you can see, so you've got the petition's got a Taiwan link, but a lot of the content has nothing to do with Taiwan. It's about racial issues, about other divisive social issues in the United States, really not necessarily anything where you would see a footprint related to China.
Just one sec, Sarah. We're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be right back. And consultant, Sarah Cook. One of the things that strikes me is, of course, we've covered at the Epoch Times a lot about various persecuted minorities, specifically transnational repression. We've talked about that before in the past as well. And so, exactly this toolkit is used across the board. And I know this is something you've written about and talked about. So give me a picture of what that looks like.
Sure. So I think, when we look at these disinformation campaigns, I would say there are like three main targets that the Chinese government has. You have this subset where it is related to elected officials. It's still relatively small, though, again, like we were talking about, it's a latent capacity. We see what they can do. Another is where they're doing things to just mess things up in a democracy, pretending to be voters and amplifying existing polarization. And then the third is where they're targeting who they perceive to be the CCP enemies, right? And so, for example, some of the recent over the last few years, you had actually an American YouTuber who went to China. This was at the height of the not only allegations but documentation about massive detentions of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and just families disappearing, people just in such huge numbers. And the Chinese government trying to fend off these accusations. So then you have this American YouTuber go to China and go to Urumqi and talk to these Uyghurs, and they show how happy they are, and so on and so forth. And later it turns out that trip was actually paid for by Chinese state media. So that's just one example. Then you see with regards to Tibetans also, and Hong Kongers, that being a community that's also been targeted by, first of all, there's a lot of different cyber attacks. There's also sometimes impersonations of accounts and things like that. One of the recent takedowns that Meta did just earlier, I think it was Meta earlier this year, Meta or Microsoft, I think it was Meta, there were accounts of people pretending to be Tibetan activists, and even a fake Human Rights Watch advisor who were posting all of these allegations about the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, claiming corruption, claiming pedophilia, and things like that. And so that's, again, this element of trying to discredit, right, these enemies of the CCP. And then I think one thing we were talking about earlier was this report that just came out this last week by the Falun Dafa Information Center, talking about a new campaign targeting Falun Gong practitioners in the Falun Gong community. It's internal leaked documents talking about the broader architecture and planning. And so 3 of the tactics that they mentioned, 2 that they've observed already, are some very suspicious YouTubers posting content that some of it is blatantly false, some of it is this weird, mixture of false and maybe true. We don't know. It's hard to know. Defaming Falun Gong and also the Shenyang Performing Arts Company. Then you've got examples of account impersonations on X. And we can talk more in general about this tactic of impersonation because it's used pretty widely also by the CCP. So that starts to get very suspicious. So now you're seeing 2 things. There's something more like bigger. This isn't just like one or two people spouting things off. Now we've got these account impersonations, and then they get these internal documents that are talking about how the Ministry of Public Security is saying we should fully support these YouTubers, we should feed them information, we should use the quote 50-cent party, which is one way of referring to like troll accounts and fake accounts to amplify them. We should also actually, a Chinese state think tank talking about, oh, we should start to try to manipulate search engines too. And in terms of like to push more, I think they use the word defamatory actually, like information about Falun Gong to search results globally. This is worldwide. So that's where you start to see these like multi-layer campaigns in some case, again, targeting these communities outside of China. I mean, there's lots of Falun Gong practitioners, lots of disinformation inside China targeting Uyghurs and Tibetans and Falun Gong practitioners. We're talking about these communities outside of China, and the CCP trying to really influence public opinion, towards these groups so that they don't get some of the support on the human rights atrocities they're facing, but also because some of these are some of the most vocal and critical voices, outside of China, being critical of the Chinese government. So basically the CCP using these tactics to discredit their enemies.
How prevalent? So in this FDI report, there's these two YouTubers that are specifically identified, I guess, as, great tools to amplify the regime message. But like, how common is that type of use of social media influencers?
I think this is one of those really tricky things to document. Like, it's happening and it's really hard to document because it's actually happening off platform, right? It's like people being co-opted offline and then it manifesting in online content, sometimes with someone seeming to be an authentic person. And sometimes real influencers who have other content that they're posting, but now they've been asked to do this. When we were doing the research for the Beijing's Global Media Influence Report, sometimes you can get these like tips of the iceberg, right? So one example is the one I gave earlier about Xinjiang. There was another example, and this is to the credit actually of two American YouTubers who kind of followed the breadcrumbs and then given by the CCP linked entity and then exposed it. But they were basically, an email was sent, they said, to 100 English language YouTubers from a company in Hong Kong, claiming that there was a promotional opportunity related to share some content about tourism in China. And they were like, oh, this seems kind of suspicious. We're going to pretend we want to do it. So they say that they pretend, they say, okay, well, we want to do it. Then they get the response, well, actually, that campaign is full, but we have another client, and we would like to offer you $2,000 to put this prepared material we'll give you, basically claiming that COVID originated in the U.S. deer population. And so these two YouTubers actually said, well, no, but they have this whole stream of emails, and they exposed it. They basically did 2 episodes talking about 2 videos on each of their own channels, talking about that this is what the Chinese government had been approaching them and approaching others to do. Now, one of the things, even when there isn't necessarily a direct monetary or funding, well, the PRC's got a whole lot of fake accounts, right? And YouTube is often, and some of these websites are based on monetization. So sometimes a quid pro quo, even if it's not necessarily outlined, could be, well, I know that if I post this, it might get really amplified. And suddenly you see somebody with 100,000 followers who has videos with 600,000 views. And so obviously they've earned more money than if they only had their normal view part, right? And is that amplification happening from Chinese networks of accounts? Sometimes that's hard to show, but we know they do that because there was one expose actually about Chinese diplomats' accounts on Twitter that were amplified by fake accounts to make them look more popular than they actually were.
Well, and just going back again to these 2 YouTubers, I've been thinking about them a lot because I know they were basically, at one point they were trying to find these disgruntled Shenyun performing arts, past staff or present performers and this kind of thing. And then, a surprising number of those people that they found ended up in subsequent New York Times reporting, which, how common is that kind of an approach?
So one of the things that the Chinese government does, or the way these campaigns unfold, and I think especially you do see it, in Taiwan especially, is where content jumps from social media into the mainstream media. And sometimes it can be because there's some deliberate tie there, but a lot of times it's unintentional. So you have this unintentional amplification. And sometimes you have unintentional amplification by other social media influencers. So there were some examples in the U.S. in the aftermath of the 2020. There was one study that the Cardiff University did that found that these PRC-linked accounts were posting things and actually, in some cases, alleging election, like fake, like ballot burning and things like that, and other situations, other content and information. And they actually got retweeted by real people, and they got spread, and got 1 million views. And in the Freedom House study, actually found examples of this type of thing happening in 13 out of the 30 countries. In Spanish, in other languages, where you have somebody who's a real influencer, and they see content, and they amplify it, not knowing that this is actually from a fake persona. And that's how it actually gets likes. Because when you actually read the tech reports about these fake accounts, usually the real fake accounts don't really get much of a following. But all it takes is like one tweet to get amplified by someone with 800,000 followers, and suddenly it's gone a lot more mainstream. And I think sometimes then, that maybe now there's some kind of echo chamber happening a little bit on social media. Now there's this phenomenon, right? And so then now maybe you have mainstream media being like, oh, what's going on here? Well, now let me report on that. And often one of the things that might happen is that, again, it's this taking advantage often of our own political polarization or kind of existing vulnerabilities.
You actually have a new Substack that you're going to be writing that I'm going to be a very dedicated reader of because I love your work. Just tell me about that.
So it's called Underreported China. And basically the idea is to really look at some of these issues, some of these things, whether it's the persecution of certain minorities, political prisoners that nobody's talking about, or using all of these different ways and sources to see how the Chinese Communist Party is trying to influence media and information outside of China, and just try to uncover it and give people a chance to understand it better, both work that I'm doing myself, but really trying to amplify some of the really good work that's being done by, like I said, some of these individuals around the world who are looking at this, but the voices sometimes get buried, so wanting to give them a bit more of a boost.
Well, Sarah Cook, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
It was nice to have this conversation, and good, nice to see you again, yeah.
Thank you all for joining Sarah Cook and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.